Lola rennt ist für mich eines der Hauptstücke auf dieser CD. Und Lola rennt hat in dem Film 3 Handlungsstränge, die fast identisch sind, wo es darum geht, ein bestimmtes Ziel zu erreichen.
For me, Run Lola Run is one of the most important pieces on this CD. Run Lola Run consists of 3 main, almost identical plot lines. It's about reaching a certain destination, an attempt that fails twice. And in this situation, a meta level is beamed into the sky where dialogue takes place. I've written this composition for 3 people, however 2 people each are having this dialogue in the sky. My idea was to avoid the classical song structure as you can find it in jazz improvisations. Instead, I wanted to write a course around which can be improvised. I've highlighted these small changes in color in the score, which means you can play the same score 3 times, but one time the green characters, one time the red, and one time the blue. There's a very free improvisation in the dialogue that takes place between trombone and me on the violin. This is a close parallel dramaturgy to the film. I really like the concept of writing a Lola, developing a form which passes through changing content. One part is perhaps more chamber music, the other part more voicings, like jazz, and the third part is new tonal or abstract or a world music theme. This concept I think is great.
Weltmusikthema, dieses Konzept finde ich eigentlich super. Ein aktuelles Stück in meinem Kopf gibt es auf jeden Fall. Ich habe gerade eine Duo-CD aufgenommen mit Theo Jürgensmann.
There's always a new piece in my mind. I just recorded a duo CD with Theo Jürgensmann. It's of course not yet published, and it includes several improvisations. There are several pieces communicating with each other in an absolutely fascinating way. This is free improvisation. Brilliant, but you can't say very much about it.
Ganz toll. Kann man nur deswegen nicht so viel drüber sagen. Man kann nicht vielleicht so inhaltlich so.
Perhaps you can't tell so much about the content as, for example, about a film. But you could say that we are 2 musicians who've been playing together for a long time, using very similar patterns and materials.
Sowieso benutzen. Ja, für mich ist die interessante Kombination.
For me, the interesting combination is that I only play the viola, something I've done fairly rarely until now, and that I play fewer cliches on the viola, which are already familiar to me. This means I discover new territories. The 2 of us produce such a terrific sound. I sing falsetto and third voices into my instrument more than usual. Viola and the clarinet have approximately the same range of tones, and we're really absolutely equal voices flying through space where we meet, and it's impossible to tell what kind of a style this is. Actually, you cannot really understand, or I sometimes can't understand, what we are doing. And this is what I find great.
Oder ich selbst verstehe manchmal nicht, was machen wir da. Und das finde ich toll. Nee.
No, it's not really a difference.
Ja, zunächst ist ja Movie Talks ist ja Programm. Movie Talks ist Programmmusik. Und was ich aktuell jetzt gemacht habe, wovon ich erzählt habe, ist improvisierte Musik. Und dazwischen gibt es einen wesentlichen Unterschied. Bei dem einen
First and foremost, movie talks is programmatic music. What I've done just now and have talked about is improvised music. There's a significant difference between the two. On the one hand, there are specific requirements. Notes. Notes always have their own timing. It's much more metric. Things are being rehearsed which are strictly defined. And you can also challenge the musician. Can he play it or can he not play it? You can play quite conventionally and freely improvise music so that you can understand it. You could even conduct this music. But this results from a completely free and spontaneous decision of both or even all protagonists involved. This is not so important in free improvisation. Everyone can have his own timing or his own idea of tempo or meter. I think the most exciting thing in music is that two people can, side by side, tell their own stories, and the overall result is an interesting network. It'd be confusing if one would let two people talk, one about this subject and the other about another subject. One would always try to understand at least one of the two subjects, and it just doesn't work simultaneously. This is different in music. And that's because improvisations with 2, 3, and 4 people work in such a fascinating way. Somehow an almost democratic network thing becomes possible. It's quite conceivable that we're nowadays even more abstract and even more open and more free, that we can say, well, we don't need the given score or cliches any longer. We can do it right at this moment. And it's obvious that a development has taken place.
Dieses Klischee oder das brauchen wir nicht mehr. Wir können es auch im Moment machen. Und da hat durchaus eine Weiterentwicklung stattgefunden.
Improvisation as such is nothing new. Improvisation has a history that's more than 1,000 years old. It's very likely that the very first musical idea ever was in improvisation. Saying this, I mean that we are now able to improvise structures, the shape of forms and motif. Compared to the development deriving from Romanticism, it tends to move towards the fixation of works. There are composers who dictate everything, and there's the performer who tries to do everything as perfectly as possible. It is somehow new, or relatively new, that we can now improvise this process.
Zu diesem, wie sagt man, das gibt den Komponisten, der schreibt alles vor, und dann gibt es den Spieler, der versucht, das so toll zu machen, wie es irgendwie geht. Dass wir diesen Prozess jetzt improvisieren können, das ist irgendwie neu. Das ist relativ neu. Man kann improvisieren, dass der Hörer denkt, es ist notiert.
You can improvise so that the listener thinks it is written, and meanwhile you can write things so easily that you could also improvise. This means these two levels form networks. This has happened for quite a while now, but there's still some sort of development. Younger performers, for example, grow up with a completely different self-image. There's no longer such a division between people who are only familiar with notation structures and those perhaps who are able to ad-lib freely, yell or produce noise structures but don't necessarily possess expressiveness. I think to be able to speak a language correctly, to generate tones, to make statements with clear pitch is on a level that's different and much more difficult. One has to do this for at least 10, 12, 15 years to get a satisfactory and intensive result.
Üben und betreiben, auf ein intensives Ergebnis zu kommen. Es ist so, wenn du eine Sprache sprechen willst, und Musik ist ja eine Sprache.
It's like this. If you want to speak a language, and music is a language, then you naturally begin to babble in childhood, trying to formulate something with sounds and with all sorts of other things beyond a conceptual necessity. At some stage, one will make the statement that one wants to make and develop a vocabulary. And if one knows his vocabulary well, the texts emerge spontaneously. And it's more or less the same procedure in music. You can do all sorts of things without reflecting, but at some stage one does it in a reflective way. And you're able to foresee the statements you want to make, and this is directly transferred to your fingers. Boring.
Das letzte Konzeptstück, das ich geschrieben habe, hat bei mir dazu geführt, dass ich mit Elektronik mal wieder gearbeitet habe.
The last concept piece I've written made me work again with electronics, with exotic instruments, recorder, rebec, and an electronically modified trumpet. The stories are more global. They summarize the electronic music and its development in a kind of new tonal way. I work more with musicians, for example, with a recorder player than before, and I include more extreme musical personalities into my projects. That's why they're even stronger, say, different than jazz, world music, or new tonal music. They try to move between these genres even more strongly.
Noch extremere Musikerpersönlichkeiten als früher in diese Projekte. Und dadurch sind sie noch stärker, sage ich jetzt mal, anders als einfach nur Jazz oder einfach nur Weltmusik oder neutönerisch. Sie versuchen noch stärker zwischen diesen Genres zu reisen. Also das letzte, wo ich mich so richtig flashmäßig dran erinnern kann, da kam ich aus dem Urlaub, war in der Alhambra, habe das also absolut faszinierend gefunden, komme nach Hause, mein Auto ist
The
abgestellt.
last clear flashback I have, I was coming back from the holidays. I was in the Alhambra and found everything absolutely fascinating. I came home and discovered that my car was being towed away, and I had to pick up the car. I was still really into this trip and completely absorbed in flamenco. I picked up the car and started to sketch down many motives. Later on, I turned it into a composition. Another time I was sitting in front of the computer. I use a computer when composing, and was jamming along myself. In the third situation, I improvise with my violin in the studio, hear exactly the notes, and modify and condense them. Just like a theater director, to something even more independent and complex.
Verdichte die dann so wie so ein Theaterregisseur zu was noch eigenständigerem und noch komplexerem. Ich bin immer wieder fasziniert von der tiefsten Seite meines Instruments.
I'm always fascinated by the lowest string of my instrument. It's a very simple story. There isn't anything lower. It has the most sonorous character of all tones on my instrument, and this is a fascinating note.
Und das ist eine faszinierende Note.
It's a C on the viola, a G on the violin, a D on the Gothic fiddle, a C on my Rebec. What I'm definitely hoping for is that there will be more networking between the different scenes and individual cultures. That it becomes easier for somebody who crosses boundaries, adopting influences from different genres, that those who work on this become more self-reliant in what they do.
Dass es einfacher wird, wenn man ein Grenzgänger ist, der quasi Einflüsse aus verschiedenen Genres holt, dass der auch ein Selbstverständnis bekommt mit dem, was er tut. Also was ist eigentlich wirklich interessant an einer interessanten Idee?
What is it that actually makes an interesting idea interesting? As a musician, you definitely face the difficulty that you cannot grasp a whole lot of ideas and fascinations with verbal language. We think in terms of music, we think in sounds, and then we run into difficulties to find a gripping format to put it into words.
Eben ganz packend zu formulieren.
Real difficulties.
Was ich eben sagen wollte, das ist die
What I wanted to say, the scenes seem to disintegrate into many small segments. At the end of the day, if you go into a CD shop, you only find very broad categories where you can look for something.
Und ein Selbstverständnis, dass quasi diese Schubladen irgendwie aufgesprengt werden und eine ganz andere Geisteshaltung irgendwie entsteht, also sowohl der Markt feiner ist und gleichzeitig globaler.
I would wish for an understanding that these categories can be dissolved and a completely new attitude can emerge where the market is more refined and at the same time more global as well as regional. That the net at the same time is finer, more closely woven, and at the same time captures global trends. Let's take a few examples. I want to give a jazz concert and can play great jazz with promoters. However, if I combine elements of jazz with chamber music, the jazz promoter says no. And the chamber music promoter says no, too. Some sort of exclusion is happening. The public audience and the promoters are searching for new ideas and possibilities to combine those two.
Es ist schon so, wenn man jetzt verfolgt, die Marktanteile, die verschiedene Musikrichtungen haben, dann kommen immer wieder Musikrichtungen hinzu, die sich auf einmal...
If you look at the market shares of different music genres, new music genres always surface and suddenly grab a significant market share. Whether it's hip-hop, techno, they did not exist 30 years ago. So you cannot say that there are no developments. But these developments don't happen within a month or a year, and then suddenly looking back you realize, hey, something new has developed here. In any case, this leads to much more commonly used stylistic expressions than in the 1950s. The structures in the concert organization business or in CD sales, let's say in capitalism as we know it, have still remained as if there were mainly three large areas, and that's actually not enough. It's also not enough as a means of orientation for people who are really looking for music. There are lots of no-goes, which naturally makes it impossible to play any concerts. That's what happens. No-go means, in an absolute free jazz idiom, somebody plays a C major chord, suddenly the audience runs away, or suddenly the cadence of a Mozart violin concerto features punk rock. Again, audience runs away. There's a real fear to get too close, but equally a loss of potential to enter new grounds.
Auch Neuland zu begehen. Veranstalter.
Organizers, not the audience, don't run that sort of risk.
Ja, es ist hart. Ich finde es auch.
Yes, it is tough, and it's a real pity. And I'm hoping that the audience will start searching for new things. Other ideas will then also be considered.
Auf jeden Fall andere Ideen hoffähig. Die Nischen gibt es. Es gibt auch die ganz neuen Möglichkeiten.
The niches exist, and there are many new opportunities to present yourself via the internet and to find your own way without considering any kind of market system or concept. You get your feedback through clicks and completely different tricks. Bot that produces clicks or more attention. Or if you happen to be a technology freak with a huge network on Facebook, in any case, it is possible.
Auf jeden Fall ist es möglich. Was sich bei mir eigentlich in den letzten 5, 6 Jahren verändert hat, das ist, dass die...
What's changed for me in the last 5 or 6 years is that the Gothic fiddle and the rebec have become much more my instruments. Gothic fiddle is tuned differently and has a different acoustic timbre. With those instruments, you're creating completely different and new colors. The Gothic fiddle is actually designed for medieval music. For me, it's a relatively new discovery that we're taking an entirely historic instrument that's only ever been used for historic performances and use it now to realize new tonal ideas and new tonal sounds. My latest project with the Gothic fiddle is a transverse flautist, and we're playing our own new overtone. How do you say this? New timbres emerge because these old instruments are still historically tuned, and the overtone structure is completely new. On the one hand, this is a completely new story, yet on the other hand, it also reflects the origins, the archaic, where music, the urge to make music comes from, which is then reflected in the new music. I find this extremely interesting.
Das Ursprüngliche, das Archaische, wo Musik und der Drang, Musik zu machen, überhaupt herkommt, sich dann trotzdem in dieser neuen Musik widerspiegelt. Und das finde ich total interessant. Das ist aber schon in den 90ern für mich passiert als Musiker, dass ich komme ja eher aus der Unterhaltungsmusik und habe Keyboard gespielt und
For me as a musician, that happened in the 90s. I come more from a light music background and played keyboards. You create a song, the song's ready, and you play it. Then you have your first gig, and you play it. Then the 10th gig, you play it. Then the 30th gig comes along, and you're still playing the same song. That's when I realized that this was not the kind of music I wanted to spend my life with. Then you try to develop ideas. How can music develop? There are song forms which are like a prison. If one starts with this musical vamp or a rhythmical story, the entire space is then actually already defined and it's clear what's going to happen. To get out of this, you have to make a clean break. You have to have sufficient courage to do so. I had the courage and moved into abstract music. And of course, upset the listener who thought, this is good, it's getting groovy. What follows is some kind of development, like a metamorphosis, which you want to continue. You just want to continue, but then you come to a point when you realize this is a completely new kind of playing, almost like we're heading towards a new cliché.
Und kommt aber dann irgendwann vor lauter Weite auch an einen Punkt, wo man sagt, da ist aber jetzt eine neue Art zu spielen, ein neues Klischee von mir aus, auf das man zusteuert und dann kommt man sich vor.
And then you feel like a traveler on a journey. Sorry, I have to move on.
Ich muss jetzt weitergehen.
You reach this moment. Yes, that's the way the kind of music I'm playing at present develops. It's not always simply abstract. It's the kind of music which includes your roots or those places where you feel at home, comfortable. This kind of inclusive style is relatively new to improvisation. There are key moments when I say, okay, that's good, I'll carry on with this. And then that's what I do.
Da gibt es einfach dann so, für mich so Schlüsselmomente, wo ich dann auf einmal sage, okay, jetzt ist gut, jetzt gehe ich weiter. Und dann mache ich das. Naja, in gewisser Weise bin ich ein sogenannter Schwimmer.
In a way, I'm what they call a swimmer. I'm a highly reactive type in both interviews and at concerts. That's my personal style.
Bei einem Konzert bin ich ein wahnsinns reagierender Typ. Das ist irgendwie so ein bisschen auch mein Personalstil. Aber so, wenn der Raum total leer ist, wenn ich einfach nur da stehe und soll jetzt spielen.
But if the room is totally empty, when I'm just standing there and have to play, I've often given solo concerts, you look at your white sheet of paper and you step out of yourself. It's the emptiness which is the source everything originates from. And that's when you need time. This spontaneity creates things you can develop. A dialogue develops which is about things from the cosmos or that appear out of nowhere. That's how I can continue any form of statement.
Mit Sachen, die von mir aus vom Kosmos kommen oder die aus dem Nichts heraus irgendwie entstehen. Und so kann ich jede Art von Aussage dann wieder weitertreiben. Wenn ich mich so ein bisschen erinnere an meine Kindheit und wo das überhaupt herkommt jetzt, also kreativ sein zu wollen, dann hatte das auf jeden Fall auch mit Spaß zu tun und
If I reflect on my childhood and I ask myself what inspired my creativity,
die ersten faszinierenden
I have to admit that it definitely had something to do with having fun, discovering new territory.
und die
The first really fascinating groups were relatively commercial bands such as rock bands.
das ist jetzt irgendwie so aus meiner
This idea of having fun and developing something that's straight out of my generation.
Da gibt's nicht diese Aufteilung. Und
Nowadays, you see these bands that develop something together. There's no such division between the brilliant composer and
dieses Konzept
someone who plays.
quasi
In the last 20 years, we have actually set the concept of rock or a band, a creative entity, working together, having fun, living for the moment on stage, on a par with chamber music.
miteinander Spaß zu haben im Moment auf der Bühne, wo das jetzt so in so einem Feld der Kammermusik auch angekommen ist. Also wo Leute, die eine ganz normale
Conventionally educated graduates from music schools who've always practiced and can play lots of pieces are now increasingly making use of their right to be creative.
machen von dem Recht Gebrauch, dass sie
These people simply hurl themselves into it, saying, "Here I am," and that's what I've been planning to do for 20 years, and now I'm doing it.
ich seit 20 Jahren
Simply having fun together on stage and showing it. That's transferred to the audience.
und das zu reflektieren.
How we play spontaneously together, that's it. And that's been my background.
Spontan.
That was all completely new to me.
Das ist eigentlich alles.
We were not allowed to do
Bei
that.
mir von meiner
There were the people who graduated from music school who were able to play
das durfte
a
man.
proper
Also da waren
instrument.
die waren an einem
Then there were the jammers who performed with their bands on a totally different level.
irgendwie die
This simply did not
auf
work.
einer ganz anderen
Didn't
Ebene
come together.
solche Bands gemacht.
One of you joined an orchestra, and the other one made pop music.
Das kam
This has since become the norm and is, I think, an achievement of the last 20 years,
Popmusik gemacht.
something to which
Das ist
I
mittlerweile
have definitely contributed.
ja, das ist ein Feld geworden. Und das, finde ich, ist das ist eine Leistung der letzten 20 Jahre und das ist was, wo ich auf jeden Fall meinen Anteil dran habe.